We are joined now by the great Brent Hubbs of VolQuest. That is On3's Tennessee site. And Brent, Tennessee opened spring practice on Monday. A very, very exciting year. New quarterback, the guy that everyone's been waiting to see, Nico Iamaleava. I feel like actually, since that Citrus Bowl performance, it's been a little quiet on the Nico front. But it feels like it shouldn't be that quiet.
No, I think it's a good thing. I mean, I think it's because of what happened last year, right? What was your phrase last year? You were driving the Joe Milton train coming out of the Clemson game, right?
Yep.
And I think, and
I drove it right into the side of a barn.
It wasn't just, I mean, everybody, there was such a buzz about Joe Milton. Whereas I think because of how that kind of worked, that maybe changed things a little bit and some of the all-season stuff. And here's the other thing too. Nico's kind of a private deal. I mean, he's kind of a private guy. I know that sounds crazy because of all the attention he's gotten, but he's a pretty low-key guy who just kind of goes about work. And I think that's what Tennessee likes about where he's at. I think he still feels like he's got a ton of things to prove. And this whole program's been pretty quiet. Of course, basketball team's winning, so that changes a little bit. But really, it's been a pretty quiet football deal when you talk about football. There's been football storylines that have nothing to do with playing football. But from a football standpoint, it's been a pretty quiet couple of months. I think Josh Heupel's pretty happy about it.
Well, and that's the thing is it feels like a good time for Tennessee to be under the radar because this is a team that could conceivably have a very good season. And that's why I wanted to have you on. Yes, they're starting spring practice, but also to go through this schedule and talk about the possibilities for Tennessee this year, because if Nico is pretty good, this is a team that could really exceed expectations, Brent.
Well, there are a couple things going for them in addition to the schedule, which we'll talk about here. But when you watch them on the practice field and you do a deep dive in the roster, the first thing that jumps out to you, they got a bunch of grown men playing on the defensive line. And this is a line of scrimmage league. It's a line of scrimmage game. It's not just in the SEC. It's everywhere. And for Tennessee, they've got defensive linemen who are men. Now, they've got some offensive linemen who are young that are going to have to learn in a hurry, but they got a bunch of men playing on defense. And I think that's something that you look at, that you say, okay, Tim Banks got plenty to build around with this defense because they're going to go 13, 14 deep on the defensive line. There may not be many teams around the country as deep as Tennessee is, and it's going to be highlighted by James Pearce, who a lot of people are talking about where his name's going to be called a year from now in the NFL draft. So that's where it starts for me with this team, but particularly this defense is that defensive front.
Well, and you look at the offensive line, you talk about some young guys, but there's also a bunch of old guys. Cooper Mays is back at center. Javonte Spraggins is a 3-year starter at guard. I know he's been dinged up and is kind of limited in the spring, but what does he need to do in the spring? Like, he just needs to be healthy come fall. It feels like, and this was the big question, because you and I have talked about this, and Austin Price, who works on your site, and I have talked about this. The question of the guys that this staff recruited on the line of scrimmage, how many of them would they develop? But it feels like, especially in the offensive line, they're still dealing with some old guys that they've had for a while.
Yeah, they are. I mean, and when you look at, you take John Campbell, who was a transfer from Miami a year ago that played left tackle. You're going to flip him to the right side, and you bring in Lance Hurd from LSU, who was a 5-star guy who was going to, at best, split time at tackle in Baton Rouge for another year, which he had no interest
behind 2 potential first rounders.
Right.
And Emory Jones and Will Campbell. Yeah,
it's not like he was a disappointment because he didn't win the job. It's right. He didn't beat out 2 guys whose names might be called, might get a hat and a hug from the commissioner a year from now. So he's got to be a plug and play guy. If those 2 guys at the tackle spot hit the way that you hope and believe that they can, you're really looking for one spot this spring, and that's at left guard. And you've got some viable candidates there, and we'll see what that looks like. But yeah, there's a belief that this team can be really solid on both sides of the line of scrimmage, which gives you a lot to work with moving forward. And then you look back at that schedule and you say, man, if we can weather early, right? If our young quarterback can handle being outside of Neyland Stadium early, boy, what does this thing look like? Because I'm going to tell you, that NC State team In December, if we were doing this podcast, I would have went, you know what? They're not going to be very good, I don't think. But you look at what they brought in from the portal: Grayson McCall at quarterback, Noah Rogers at wide receiver, a running back who's got experience, who could play. They have made over that offense at NC State. And we know that they play defense over there, right? I mean, that's typically what they hang their hat on year in and year out. I think that NC State game is taking on a little different tenor than what it was going to be when Tennessee was getting ready to play Iowa in the bowl game. I'm not saying NC State's suddenly going to go out and win the ACC, but when you looked at losing 24 guys to the portal, which they were, and what they replaced with, Andy, that they had a pretty nice portal flip of that roster for them heading into next season.
Yeah, I think they should feel pretty good about it. And I actually love this as a test for Tennessee. And probably, love it as a test for NC State as well, because neither one of these is they're going to win their conference kind of team that you're looking at right now. Now, maybe Tennessee grows into that. It's possible. But it's not an impossible feat to go win this game. It's a good test for young players and a good confidence boost if Tennessee can win it, because then they have another game to kind of warm up with Kent State, and then they go to Norman. And that at Oklahoma game for Tennessee is pretty critical, because if they win that game and they win the NC State game, there's a house money situation.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, there's no doubt. And again, now you're asking a lot of a quarterback who has played 4 quarters, essentially, that count. Everything else was mop-up duty. So you're asking a lot of that. You're asking a lot of Brew McCoy to get back and be, ready to help you and be what you hope that he can be as a wide receiver. You're replacing a running back in Jalen Wright, who I think was undervalued. We're seeing that by what he did at the combine and sort of the NFL buzz he is generating right now. He had a terrific year a season ago. Can Dylan Sampson be a bell cow back for you? Is Cam Seldon, who's a sophomore, ready to really take on a serious role in the backfield? So there are questions, but everybody has questions. I think you feel a little better about your questions if you're Tennessee, because you think you're going to be able to win in the line of scrimmage, and you feel like you got a quarterback who's going to be able to do some things that you couldn't do a year ago. I asked Josh Heupel on Monday when Tennessee opened spring practice about building his offense around Nico, because that's one of the things Heupel's always talked about, is we can win with a tall guy, a skinny guy, a short guy, a guy who can run. We just kind of make it for the quarterback. Well, I'm curious as to what that is with Nico. And he said, there's some things that we'll tinker with and mess with this spring and look at and see where we are. But I think there's a belief they can do more things offensively with Nico at quarterback than what they ended up being able to do with Joe Milton at quarterback last season.
You may, after we talk about that win total, or while we talk about that win total, want to go to FanDuel.com/Staples and sign up. If your first $5 bet wins, you get $200 in bonus bets. Now, you're probably going to want to sprinkle some on these NCAA tournament games, maybe on these NIT games, who knows? But you also may want to sprinkle some on that Tennessee 8.5. You may feel some type of way about it after you hear me and Brent talk about it. You may say, I don't know. Maybe 8.5 feels a little high. I suspect, though, you will feel like 8.5 feels a little low. But that is the beautiful thing about FanDuel. However you feel, they've got an option for you. So FanDuel.com/Staples. If your first $5 bet wins, you get $200 in bonus bets. Sign up today in time for the NCAA tournament. Yeah, and I think it starts with the run game, because, coming out of the Orange Bowl against Clemson, you loved the way Joe Milton had thrown the ball. But then you watch him as the starter at Tennessee and you realize, okay, he's not great at the read option stuff. And it looked like, RPO stuff wasn't even really there, because you didn't have the traditional read option piece of it. Nico, again, it's a small sample size, but you look at him against Iowa, which is a very good defense. They had everybody playing except for Cooper DeJean, who was hurt. He seemed to know when to keep the ball and when not to keep the ball. And that is a valuable skill because it essentially takes away a defender, whether that's in coverage or in the box. You have to decide who's going to deal with the quarterback in that situation. I don't think the defenses felt like they had to deal with the quarterback run with Joe Milton.
No, because Joe was a reluctant runner, not a willing runner, and I think Nico will be a more willing runner. I think the other thing too is the processing of that. Right, you're seeing more and more of this. It's not just read it and run, but it's read it. Then are you running or are you throwing? You know, the RPO out of it. A lot of different things you can do there, and I think some of those possibilities are there with Nico that weren't there a year ago. I tell you the other place it may help a little bit. If you go look at this run game, one of the challenges this run game has had against some opponents is opponents playing a three-man front with an overhang linebacker. If you bring the quarterback legs into play, that changes sort of how they play you a little bit. And that's something that Tennessee had some difficulties with. You go back to that Missouri game a year ago, they had a really hard time with Missouri's defensive front and that overhang linebacker in that three-man front. Georgia is a different animal because they're Georgia, and Missouri was good last year, but Tennessee had some issues there. That's something that I think Nico could help them with because of not just his willingness to run with his legs, Andy, but also his processing, because you got to make some quick decisions. And I think Nico has the ability to process pretty quickly as he continues to grow in this offense.
Yeah, and those guys who are natural in terms of read option, they've done it their whole careers. They understand when to keep, when to pull. And I think that does help. And it doesn't matter how fast you are. Like it speeds up your offense when that person can make that decision very quickly and can make it very instinctually. And that it seems like Nico's that guy. It also seems like Nico's a little bit bigger, which Nico was a string bean as a recruit, but you look at his dad, who's 6'7", 300 something pounds, and think, okay, what is Nico as a 20-year-old, as a 21-year-old? And I think we're starting to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's had a good offseason. I think this team in general has had a good offseason in the weight room. But I think you're seeing a little more definition out of Nico and a little more bulk. I don't think anybody's going to ever accuse him of being a big guy, a true heavy guy, if you will. But certainly his arms are bigger than they were, and I think he's added some weight. You got to remember, man, this guy's tall. I mean, like he's not a 6'4" guy. And when you look at him, okay, he weighs like $180 or whatever. I mean, he's 6'6". So carrying 230 pounds at 6'6" looks different than it does at 6'3" or 6'4". So, I don't think he's ever going to be accused of being large or being huge, but I do think he's definitely added some quality weight and some muscle. I know that's been a huge priority of his this offseason, and I think it showed up on the practice field when Tennessee was out there on Monday.
And so another priority for him in the offseason was helping Tennessee recruit some help for him in terms of receivers. Chris Brazzell from Tulane seems like a guy who could come in there and get targets pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, and he's got a great opportunity this spring because Brew McCoy's out. So he's going to work as an outside receiver. Nathan Laycock is not going through spring right now. We'll see where he's at. So you're down a couple of bodies there to begin with. And now Brazzell's got a chance to really jump in there and push Chaz Nimrod and Caleb Webb and some of these guys who need to have big springs. I think the opportunities are there for the taking for Chris Brazzell, and we'll see how he goes. Highly productive guy from Tulane, a true outside receiver, big frame guy, tall, long guy. Looks like he can get out and go on you pretty good. So I'm curious to see how he goes throughout this spring. I think a guy nobody talks about in that receiving group, and Mike Matthews deserves all of this, the accolades he gets. 5-star player. He was really good in the All-Star games. I think he's going to be a factor for Nico and can do some things in this offense. This guy, Braylon Staley, that they got from South Carolina, is a bit of an under-the-radar guy, true slot receiver. Now, they've got Squirrel White there, but who's the backup slot? It may very well be Staley when it's all said and done because I tell you what, I like the way he looks. I like the way he moves. He did some nice things in bowl prep to get everybody's attention. I think he's had a good offseason to start. We'll see how it goes throughout spring, but you see a quick twitch guy in the slot, and in this offense, Andy, the slot position could be such a productive position for Josh Heupel and company. I think there's some weapons there for Nico to work with. I think the real question for this offense outside of left guard, what do they look like at tight end? Because that is a key element to this offense being successful.
So you mentioned how deep they can be on the defensive line. How important was it to keep Rodney Garner? And Rodney Garner's worked at a lot of different places in the SEC. He's an Auburn grad. Sounds like Auburn really wanted him to come home. He stayed in Knoxville. How important was that?
Well, I think it's important because of how technical Rodney Garner is in his coaching. Rodney is a 3 decades position coach. You don't see that, right? Most of those guys moving on to be coordinators. That's never been Rodney. That's never been anything Coach Garner's looking to do. He wants to coach defensive linemen, and he coaches the finite details of those defensive linemen. And if you want to know what he's meant to the group, Omar Norman Lott came back. Omari Thomas came back. All of these guys that they had, Bryson Eason came back. These guys that you wondered if they would return for a super senior season or if they would try to go pro or, would you stay in a group that's going to be 13 deep, when you talk about the whole defensive line, they all stayed. And I think that says a lot about Coach Garner, who is not easy to play for. I mean, I'm out there watching him Monday. He's had another knee replacement. Now, both knees are done. He had his other one done back at the end of January, 1st of February. He's out there with a cane right now. And, I mean, you would have thought they were prepping for Alabama on day 1 of spring practice because he was loud. Yeah. Guys were repeating drills. It was game on from the get-go. There's no acclimation period. It doesn't exist, Andy.
Sparing with his praise is the phrase I would use about Rodney Garner. Like, if he says a nice thing about you as a player, you're probably a first round.
Yeah, frame it, right? I mean, because listen, he's going to talk to the media on Saturday, and everybody's going to talk to him about James Pearce, and he's going to tell you everything James Pearce doesn't do well right now. And that's the way it goes. And James Pearce, I mean, is a top 10 draft pick if he stays healthy. I mean, he may be a top 5 draft pick because of what he can do and his ability to play in space and rush the quarterback. But if you watch practice or you listen, at some point you think, man, James Pearce is going to be lucky to get off the scout team this year because that's just the way it is with Rodney. Now, guys appreciate it as you get older. You really appreciate it. I've had a chance to do a couple of stories on guys. I talked to Richard Seymour, and he was like, he's the best thing that ever happened to me, and I talked to Byron Young, who was arguably defensive rookie of the year in the NFL this past year. And Byron Young said, for the first 2 weeks of spring practice, I went back to the dorm every day questioning whether or not I could play at the SEC because I couldn't even get in a stance to make Rodney Garner happy. But you stay the course, you work through it, and you see where the end result is. And for Byron Young, it's a position to make a lot of money in the National Football League, and he's not the only one. There's a lot of guys that are a result of Rodney Garner because of his tough love and hard coaching.
So let's take a look at this schedule. And the depth on the defensive line can be pretty critical as far as that goes. Where it gets meaty, we mentioned that game at Oklahoma. Now, they get a week off after that. Then comes a stretch of at Arkansas, Florida, Alabama. Now, at Arkansas on its face doesn't look like it'd be that bad. We don't know if Arkansas is going to be good or not. There's a chance Arkansas could bounce back. The Florida game is really interesting, but it's in Knoxville. Whatever juju Tennessee has in Gainesville, I don't know. I don't understand it. I don't know why they can't seem to win there, but it feels like they've broken that curse in Knoxville. So they got that. Then comes Alabama, which Tennessee won the last time Alabama came to Knoxville. This time, no Nick Saban. Like, how different does that feel?
Oh, it's going to be totally different because everybody playing Alabama is going to go into that game with a different level of confidence. And that's not to say Kalen DeBoer can't coach and they can't do things, but the juju of Alabama, the mojo, the fact that Nick Saban would will you to a win, or the opposing fan bases would say Nick Saban would get help from the officials to help you get to the win, or whatever the case may be, is not there. So the feeling is that Alabama is gettable. How gettable are they, Andy? I mean, we'll see, right? I mean, it's way too early to say what they're going to be, what they are not going to be. They're going to be different than they've been in the past. But how good they are, how good they're not, we'll see. I mean, for Tennessee, when you look at that stretch, to me, it starts with that Florida game. Okay. Everybody, a lot of people are going to pencil that in as a Tennessee win. Tennessee's got to go win it. Okay.
Yeah, you can't just assume that. That's a dangerous assumption.
I've seen way too much voodoo doll or something going on with that series that makes no sense. Knoxville or in Gainesville, Tennessee's got to go win that football game. Now the question is going to be, where is Nico and where has this offense grown over the course of the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season? We talked about the test at NC State. You go to Oklahoma. How do you handle that road environment? 2 young quarterbacks in that game. That game's got a chance to have a bunch of mistakes in it and a bunch of plays. That game could be wild as could be. Then you got to get yourself right, win or lose, to take on Arkansas at Arkansas, where, we don't know what they're going to be. But the question is, when you get to that Florida game, is how set are you? How much is your identity cast? Do you know exactly who you are? Are you still trying to figure yourself out? You better hope you know who you are. And if you do, then you like where you're at. Florida, that's going to be a game that look at the close to Florida's season, right? That's when they got to win on the road. That's a real challenge. That'll be a desperation type game, I think, early on for Florida. So an intriguing matchup, but you mentioned that middle gauntlet is stout. Tennessee's used to playing the middle gauntlet games. So we'll see. It's what makes it fun. I mean, this is a group that has a chance to grow. And Josh Heupel's teams have gotten better throughout the year for the most part since he's been here. Can this team do that?
Well, the other thing we have to figure out is, what does it mean in relation to the new college football, the new format, the new postseason? So FanDuel has Tennessee at 8.5 wins. Like, it's interesting because that's not the will they or won't they make the playoff question, which is what they're asking about Missouri, Ole Miss, LSU, and Alabama. All of them are at 9.5. This isn't a will they make the playoff over. I think 9 is it's not a safe bet, but I'd feel pretty good about that. My question is, can Tennessee win 10? Because I think if you win 10, you can make the playoff. And I think if they are 6-1 after the first 7, they're going to make the playoff.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can make that case, without a doubt. And again, I mean, I think that's the fun part of it is Tennessee's in a conversation. They haven't been in a conversation, very much the last decade and a half. There's a relevancy factor there that hasn't been there. Listen, you get every beat writer on here for every team that's projected as a playoff team, with the exception of maybe Georgia. And of course, Michigan's got questions with a new coaching staff, but you look at talent, there's a few teams you go, okay, that's playoff. They're a playoff team. They should be a playoff team. There's a lot of people with a lot of holes. Now, the transfer portal makes those holes very fillable very fast in a lot of ways. If you hit, that's why you look at this thing for Tennessee. Jerron McCoy at corner is really important for Tennessee. Okay. You look at Jacoby Thomas, who's a transfer from MTSU. He's got to hit because you're replacing 2 safeties in the back end who had a ton of experience. And I mentioned it earlier. There's no more important position on the football field for Josh Heupel's offense outside of quarterback than the tight end spot. They play with a tight end almost exclusively on offense. They don't go 4 and 5 wide, even though there's depth at receiver. They want that tight end in there because they can manipulate so much in the run game with the ability to flex a tight end out, move him back in, make him an inline blocker, an H-back, do a bunch of different things with those guys at tight end. Can Holden Stays handle that? Ethan Davis, can he handle that? Can he be physical enough? Where are they at that tight end position? They only really have 2 tight ends on the roster. Cole Harrison will be a third who arrives this summer, but I'm not sure that as a high school senior graduating in May, how much he's going to be able to help them this fall. If there's one position they can ill afford an injury outside of quarterback, it's the tight end position. That position they must hit with Stays, and they must stay healthy there for this offense to achieve what fans expect them to achieve with Nico, the balance in the run game, and what we saw 2 years ago that everybody wants to try to get back to.
Well, and they also may not have to score as many if that D line is as good as we think it's going to be. That's the other piece of this.
It is. And the one step that they have to make defensively, Andy, is taking that defensive line and using its strength to their advantage with pass rush and things. They've got to get off the field on 3rd and long. They were not very good on 3rd and long a year ago. They did a great job getting teams into 3rd and long, but in SEC play, particularly in losses, they had a horrible time getting off the field on 3rd down. You look at that loss early in the year last year and in Gainesville, a couple of critical 3rd and longs in that first half where Tennessee failed to get a stop and get off the field, changed really the demeanor of that game. Tennessee's got to be a better defense on 3rd and long, whether that means they blitz more, whether they play coverage better. They've got to be much better there. They really struggled after Kamal hadn't got hurt. They've got to play 3rd and long better, Andy, if they're going to get to where you're talking about 9.5, potentially 10 wins.
Well, we will find out if they can do it and probably find out pretty early. That NC State game probably going to tell us a lot. So Brent Hubbs, yes, it's every time we do one of these, I get more excited because of these early season games that are going to really kind of feed us some information. Brent, I can't wait. Hopefully, little birdie said I might be visiting Knoxville soon. So
I'll see you then.
Hopefully see you soon.
All right, buddy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On 3 Sports YouTube channel.